the title of this talk is, as Stan's just said, it's the Kinder Scout Mass Trespass, 90 years on, Communist History and Official Myths. Hopefully the talk will have the effect of electrifying you like track rails, but if that doesn't happen and you remain shunted in a siding somewhere in the English countryside, then just bear in mind that it isn't actually the CPG's fault, as I pitched this talk to them and they kindly agreed to host it. So thanks to them for that. But if anything goes wrong, it's very much my fault and not theirs. And if you're pining for country file after an hour and a half, yeah, blame me, not them. I'm hoping perhaps in vain that you might have read my article on the Kinder Scout Mass Trespass in the latest Weekly Worker, because I'm going to partly going to speak to that, excuse me, in the first section, although I want to spend the latter part kind of discussing the process whereby sections of the history of the Communist Party of Great Britain, and I'm talking for most of this meeting really about the old official Communist Party of Great Britain, the CPGB as I'm going to refer to it, that existed between 1920 and 1991. I'm going to discuss the process where that organisation's history has had a kind of respectable kind of makeover. I'm going to discuss a little bit at the end on what possibly can be done to kind of combat that trend. I've had to, when I've written this talk, I've tried to explain as much as I can to people who aren't kind of familiar with some of the kind of ins and outs of this, but I have to kind of assume my audience has some familiarity with the kind of basic dimensions of communist history in the 20th century. Like I say, I'll try and explain particular things kind of where possible, but I've had to pitch it at a level where, you know, I expect people to know and understand certain things. That's kind of inevitable about doing things like this. Otherwise, you just get lost in explanations for an hour, which is not very helpful. Well, that kind of brings an end to the first admin-based part of the talk. So, without further ado, we'll move on to the rest of it. So, in the first part of it, I'm going to talk a little bit about what the Kinder Scout Mass Trespass was. So today is the 90th anniversary of the Kinder Scout Mass Trespass. The trespass was carried out by young Lancashire communists, and it was led by a young Communist League member called Benny Rothman, who some of you may have heard of. Who Benny Rothman subsequently became like a trade union organizer in the Lancashire area and surrounding areas for the Communist Party of Great Britain after this kind of episode, and was a CPGB member after the Second World War, and still fairly late on, I think. Kinder Scout itself is a kind of moorland plateau in the Derbyshire Peak District that is now it's now part of a national park. I've never actually been to Kinder Scout myself. To be absolutely honest, that kind of landscape always looked quite bleak to me, given that I come from Oxfordshire, where it's more like sweet earth and kind of rolling hills, and I always thought that things like Kinder Scout look fairly kind of bleak to me, although I am being educated slowly in the kind of beauties of different kind of landscapes. But leaving my history aside, and going back to the history of 1932, which is when this mass trespass by young communists took place. Back in 1932, this was private land and it was owned by the Duke of Devonshire. And given that rambling and hiking were mass working class leisure pursuits in the 1930s, there's lots of literature on this that's quite interesting. But you know, rambling and hiking were you know, they really were the mass pastime of the English working classes, given that they were, given that it was a fairly kind of cheap pastime, and that you could get cheap rail fares to kind of facilitate that kind of thing. This is the kind of appeal to this kind of thing of getting out into the kind of great outdoors. And young communists and young socialists and young Labour Party members were no different to that kind of general trend. But unfortunately for those ramblers, the vast majority of the English countryside, including its kind of most beautiful kind of spots, then and as now actually was in the hands of private owners, and it was closed to working class ramblers. So it was like a particularly kind of brutal demonstration of the class system in action, as opposed to, you know, as applied to people's kind of leisure time. Now, you might this weekend have read a kind of veritable pile of nonsense, really, about the 90th anniversary in the media this weekend. There's been things in the newspapers, on the broadcast media. I've looked at some of it and ignored most of it because it's not, none of it's very edifying or very historically accurate. But anyway, this mass trespass of 1932 has been adopted now by all sorts of kind of official bourgeois and pro-capitalist institutions and figures. As the mass trespass in 1932 by Rothman and company ended up in a confrontation and basically a fight between the young communists and the gamekeepers employed by the Duke of Devonshire, and basically the trespass leaders, the ringleaders, were sent to jail after this. I mean, it makes it kind of a suitably kind of dramatic event to add colour and life, you know, to the contemporary reformist and pro-establishment politics of the likes of the EU-loving capitalist Green Party politician Caroline Lucas, who I see is being inflicted upon the anniversary celebrations this weekend. But you know, these figures who are effectively bland kind of bourgeois reformist politicians, these type of events, as long as they're suitably distanced in the past, they can add a nice bit of like topical kind of colour, romance and drama to basically what are very kind of these days very kind of prosaic politics. What has been bled out of the memory of the event, though, is its status, which is immediately apparent when you kind of look at any of the actual historical sources from 1932 and the time, as an event led by young communists. And also this event, it represented important facets of the Young Communist League and CPGB's culture of the time. Communist affiliations are occasionally mentioned these days when you read about this on behalf of the protagonists, but the communist kind of background to it is scarcely analysed, or at least very rarely kind of lingered over. So it's kind of just mentioned in passing, really, as if it's a kind of ephemeral part of this historic event. Now, the mass trespass was formerly, it was led by members of the Lancashire British Workers' Sports Federation, BWSF, which by 1932 was led pretty much by the YCL and CPGB. It was led by young communists. It wasn't set up like that. It was initially set up by Labour Party members, but there'd been a kind of power struggle within that organisation. And by this time, it was pretty much, you know, a YCL-dominated organisation. Not all the people involved in the BWSF, British Workers' Sports Federation, would have been communists, but or even politicos, but a fair proportion of them would be, and they were the dominant organisation in it. A Daily Worker report of the time talking about the mass trespass, it said, returning from the encounter with the gamekeepers employed by the Duke of Devonshire, that's what that's referring to, the hikers, and the Daily Worker used hikers with speech marks to point up the irony. The hikers sang the red flag and shouted, down with the landlords and ruling classes and up with the workers and down with the bobbies, i.e. the policemen. Much was made in the subsequent court trial of the Daily Workers and books by Lenin that were being found on the trespassers, and there was lots of questions in court. You know, is Lenin that Russian gentleman, and so forth. So Rothman, Benny Rothman, who was a young mechanic, he told the press before the trespass he was obviously a fine he was a fine publicist, Rothman, and could talk a good game as well as act out one. He said, with sufficient support, we believe we can make our action effective, even in the face of the opposition we shall no doubt receive from gamekeepers and police. We feel we cannot any longer submit to being deprived of the beauties of the countryside for the convenience of the landowners. Wherever we claim we have a just right to go, we shall trespass en masse. So this event, really, when you kind of look at it in the cold light of day of the actual sources of 1932, and not reading the subsequent kind of subsequent narrative that's grown up about it. It was a kind of classic, what you'd say, it was an itchy-footed kind of action of the third period as that period of Comintern politics was called, of CPGB politics was called, on the late 1920s and 30s, where in this period the CPGB was stressing a kind of an uber confrontational attitude to the forces of the establishment and any kind of hangers-on like the Labour Party. It tends to be called, it tends to be kind of labelled ultra left, which is true for the most part, although there's some important kind of distinctions to be made in that, which we don't have time to go into here. But really, it was a highly confrontational, where the emphasis was on action and militant mass action. Basically, the action of Rothman and company was designed to get up the noses of what they called the reformist Ramblers Federation. The Ramblers Federation showed a far more cautious attitude to the rights of hikers and ramblers. And as Rothman made clear later on, he strongly suspected, and I think rightly, that unlike now, the middle-class leadership of various established ramblers groups strongly disliked the idea of young communists tramping through the countryside, because it basically the Ramblers Federation thought the YCL and communists were queering its pitch, which was more softly, in a reformist kind of approach that gently pushed people into action and through parliamentary bills and so forth. Rothman and the company weren't interested in that. But it was actually the ridiculous prison sentences of up to 6 months some of these people received in prison that actually galvanized wider support for the trespassers, and not the tactics of the event itself. The established Ramblers groups pretty much hated the whole idea of Rothman and the YCL leading this kind of thing, and they were very wary of it. This is a narrative that's substantively kind of changed over time. So really, you can read about the kind of way that unfolded kind of blow by blow in the article that you all haven't read. But by the time of the 50th anniversary in 1982, that's 40 years ago, as I detail in the article, the process of the Labour Party's leadership recuperating that event on behalf of the establishment was already well underway, and as is made clear by some academic historians, there is a certain irony in that, given that the Labour Party of the time of 1932 would have opposed the kind of the politics of the communist mass trespass of 1932. But we have to be clear that really it was the CPGB itself that surrendered the idea of a communist mass trespass in 1932, being led at this point by the Euro-communist faction and the party's kind of conservative, kind of right opportunist bureaucracy of that point. The Euro-communists and the CPGB leadership willingly kind of bled the event of its communist significance, just as they had bled all of the CPGB's politics of that type of any kind of communist significance. And also Tony Chater's supposed kind of oppositionist morning star of that time, they went along quite happily with this in 1982, this bleeding of the event's kind of communist identity. The party's history was pretty much on this particular point was surrendered kind of reactionaries, just like the party itself was surrendered to reactionaries and the ignominy of political liquidation. The situation today where any old bourgeois politician can kind of come along and claim an event such as the Kinder Scout mass trespass is one that was kind of heartily contributed to by people who actually called themselves kind of communists. So this process that you see today is something that was actually started in the official CPGB itself. The idea that the Euro-communist CPGB and the Morning Star fixed on the Kinder Scout mass trespass, which has been subsequently taken up by nearly like everyone else, is that basically the Kinder Scout mass trespass paved the way for the Attlee government's 1949 National Parks and Access to the Countryside Act, which led to the creation of some kind of national parks after the Second World War. This process was repeated in the new Labour era when the Kinder Scout mass trespass was claimed to be an inspiration for the Countryside and Rights of Way Act in 2000. The situation now is that the right to roam only exists actually for 8% of the English countryside only. I don't know what the situation is in Scotland and Wales. I haven't looked that up. And Mark Spencer, who is the leader, the Conservative leader of the House of Commons, he could lecture us this week that, this is to quote him, we have to recognise the countryside is not just a place of leisure, but it is also a place of business and food production. In other words, private property is sacred. Bugger off that's the actual subtext of that kind of rhetoric. This actually shows what the Labour Party reforms actually led to. They led to a kind of sanctification of property rights and restrictions in the countryside in return for an access to what in England we have as a mere 8% of the countryside. And it's kind of this mess of reformist pottage that the CPG kind of surrendered its kind of militant history for in linking the kind of mass trespass of 1932 to the subsequent kind of acts of the Labour Party kind of in Parliament. National parks were, of course, like a gain for like working class people and all people actually. But the cost of that, which is keeping 92% of land under private ownership, is arguably kind of greater. And as can be seen, this kind of squalid barter, which is what those kind of acts kind of represent, i.e., we would like access to this, but you can keep this, which some CPGB writers on this kind of history, such as Howard Hill, that have been intelligent enough to realise that that is actually what was been going on during this process. But you can see from this is very, very little to do with the actual YCL, Young Communist Mass Trespassers in 1932, who, whatever the severe faults of the international communist movement at that juncture, whatever the faults of the CPG at that juncture, by the fact of them touting an end to the ruling class and landlords and thus private ownership, they saw the issue with more rationality than any of the people who took on their mantle. Never mind the kind of supine and stupid commentary of modern times. A kind of note of caution, though, on this point. We can't merely emulate the Communist Party of Great Britain or the YCL of 1932 and just counterpose militant action and sparking the class struggle into life through demos, strikes and protests to the broader political landscape that surrounds issues such as access to the countryside. These kind of third period politics, they relied upon a very simplistic kind of conception of working class consciousness as evolving through organising around specific injustice, and hence by that route you get towards the revolution. So the basic idea, crudely put, is that you have a strike, you have a demo, you have an outbreak, you have a demonstration against some injustice, and then we march along the road from that point along to the British Revolution and to the Soviet Britain. This was actually a kind of deformation of some of the CPGB's approach in the 1920s, periodically, especially in journals such as the Sunday Worker. CPGB treated its audience as the advanced part of the working class. They recognizes the political differences that existed within its audience, and they talked to that audience in a politically advanced way. It wasn't, and they recognized that people had a political history and that they came from a certain point, which means that to some degree, the Sunday Worker was like a paper full of debate between kind of working class protagonists. The CPGB of the 1932 had a different kind of conception of the working class, which was shown in the Daily Worker, which was the successor to the Sunday Worker. It dealt with kind of politics in a different way. You did read things about party culture in the Daily Worker, but the way it kind of approached issues, it was very much about sparking the class into life through a kind of more rudimentary process of kind of protest. And the CPGB actually theorized at that point that it was actually immediate issues that were more important, and they tried to as many Trotskyist groups have subsequently tried to do, they've tried to kind of almost capsize the existing kind of labor movement by this process of approaching immediate demands in a kind of militant kind of way. Doesn't work now, didn't work then. But so this was, so we can't, even though I would say that I would rather probably have the politics of Benny Rothman and the YSL in 1932 than the establishment figures proclaiming the Kinderscout mass trespass today. This is not any sort of alternative really, and that's not what I'm trying to suggest. I'm going to kind of move on to so that really is the terrain of what's kind of happened to the history of the Kinderscout kind of mass protests, and how the view of that has changed kind of through history and what's occurred. It's something that's been recuperated by the establishment by draining it of its kind of communist kind of impetus. I'm now going to move on just to talk a little bit about some of the kind of more broader things, because obviously this what this kind of represents is more broadly the way that parts of the Communist Party's history have been used by alien kind of forces, and there's been a kind of process of exhuming the CPGB and its history. I think it's important to recognise really that this is a product of the fact that the official CPGB was wound up in 1991. And the forces that now exist around that title of CPGB, including the Morning Star CPB, the hosts of this forum and the various other organizations that have got the title of Communist Party in this country, they're all still factions really without a party. There's no real Communist Party that exists in society. There's basically a succession of campaigns for the Communist Party, and as far as kind of polite society is concerned, parts of the CPGB's history can now be safely excavated, and in that process, its specific political culture can be pushed to one side because it's deemed to be dead, and it's deemed to be a safe kind of thing to do by talking about this. You're not going to raise it up from the dead in the kind of, to name is to kind of summon kind of act. This had already become quite apparent actually in the 1990s and 2000s. If you look back, at that point in those 2 decades, CPGB history became relatively popular among academics in this country, and there was the production of quite a number of kind of academic kind of works at that point, all which had problematic politics, some of which were very useful and were, expanded our kind of view of the CPGB by having a broader range of sources to pull from. But I'll talk about those in a little while. But you can kind of see this process at work. It can be shown by the subsequent treatment of the writer and the ex-CPGB member, Edward Upward. By the 1970s, Edward Upward had been an intellectual, really, who'd been recruited by the CPGB in the 1930s. But even after he left the CPGB, he produced a number of novels which drew on his experience within the organisation, the party. But by the 1970s, he had become what he later referred to in a story as an unmentionable man. That's the title of one of his short stories of kind of later years. And the final installment of a trilogy he wrote called The Spiral Ascent was only actually published because of Arts Council funding. This was in the 1970s, and the intervention of some of his more famous literary friends would gradually run out of publishers. And he was suspicious, really, because he still viewed, he obviously still viewed the history of the CPGB and the communist movement in this country. He obviously viewed that as somehow being as the fact that he was a protagonist of this kind of movement, and there was still a live thing. And in the 70s, when Upward began to struggle, the CPGB, although it was kind of much reduced, and in retrospect, we can see how wounded the CPGB was by 1970s, this was still an organisation that had sufficient kind of power in the labour movement. And particularly in the trade union movement, and we know all about the liaison committee and all the other kind of things that had power on the docks. His power was patchy and kind of uneven, but it was a real force in the labour movement, and it effectively choked off all the organisations to its left. It was a kind of invincible kind of roadblock for them at that kind of point. So the CPGB was still a live project as far as the bourgeois commentators thought, and this kind of led into this situation where Upward became, as he said, unmentionable. And Upward also had a rather kind of, although he'd left the organisation in 1948 after a factional struggle with his wife Hilda, and they struggled against the party's reformism. He had a quite heroic kind of view of the party in the 1930s, at least, when he joined it. He joined at the end of the third period and was involved through the Popular Front. So, but then you get into the situation, but by the mid 2000s, I think it was about 2004 and 2005, this stuff started to appear with the CPGB safely dead. Upward, who was, I think he was over 100 or nearing 100 at this point, he could be safely exhumed in the media, and he was kind of presented as I don't know, a Marxist kind of intellectual curio, and he'd been a friend of W.H. Auden and Christopher Isherwood, and he'd been to Cambridge, which is obviously a famous kind of destination kind of point for English on British communists from the 30s. And so, but he was, and he suddenly had like a broadsheet, very kind of sympathetic kind of like treatment, completely different to what we've been treated before. But the idea I'm just trying to get across is the CPGB is dead. So then Edward Upward's suddenly safe because he's just a kind of curio, and he can just be, poked and prodded around a bit, but but very safely. So his kind of trajectory shows what happened and how the CPGB could by that point be discussed within polite society without a sneer and without being unmentionable, as he put it. There's just to illustrate this kind of process, I've got a couple more examples of the way, like, British communist history has been kind of recuperated by the establishment. I haven't studied its intellectual evolution in detail, but you can see a similar thing occurring, I think, to the treatment of the Kinder Scout mass trespass. It's happened also in relation to the Battle of Cable Street of 1936, when the CPGB along with other groups of the time, such as the ILP, and what I suspect were quite a lot of rank and file Labour Party members as well. That's true. They organised to stop Oswald Mosley and the British Union of Fascists marching into the East End. Now, the CPGB, of course, recruited and organised many Jewish members in Stepney and in other areas of London. And one of the most famous CPGB leaders of that era, Phil Paratin, he was obviously of Jewish origin, as were many other kind of leading communists in that area. So I'm not disputing the Jewish origins and the fact that the CPGB was strong amongst the Jewish working class. It obviously was, and Jewish members played a role in it, a leading kind of role in it. But the Battle of Cable Street is now presented as if you look in some of the treatments of it in recent years, it's now presented not really as a political CPGB event. It's more presented as a Jewish community event, really, which means it's been actually appropriated by the kind of thoroughly anti-communist Labour Party right. And that will become apparent to you if you attend any of the commemoration events of Cable Street. I attended one, and I was very shocked to see certain people in the audience because I wouldn't have even described them as being particularly left-wing. I wouldn't have described them as being socialist, but they were quite happy to come along to this, as I say, which was it was something presented as a kind of community event. And I picked this up more or less at random from a 2006 website's introduction. This was a website that was produced on the 80th anniversary of Cable Street. It said, it is 80 years since the Jewish community of East London and its allies, interesting word, allies, I wonder who they were, blocked the streets in order to prevent Oswald Mosley and his British Union of Fascists marching through. That's the introductory kind of sentence, and on that site, at best the CPGB plays a very kind of supporting role, and this is a kind of clear shift in the historical narrative from what had gone before. If you look at Arnold Wesker's 1956 play Chicken Soup with Barley, this dealt with the Battle of Cable Street by, yes, foregrounding Jewish characters, and it did foreground the Jewish community, but those Jewish characters and that Jewish community were heavily mediated by the experience of the CPGB, with the heroic picture of the party in 1936 organising the Battle of Cable Street. That was contrasted to the kind of disintegration of the CPGB during the Cold War, as Jewish members had to face up to the repression of Jewish people in the USSR. So, but Chicken Soup with Barley is a play, that's saturated with the idea of the CPGB in the foreground, and which is, I think, is historically accurate. And when you read Paratin's "Our Flag Stays Red," this idea of a Jewish community is always filtered through working class and communist identity, the which actually trump whatever people's kind of origins or were the beginning of that. So we have actually got a reverse of that, of the way in which these events were being presented. So Wesker's completely correct to kind of foreground the communism, given that the Battle of Cable Street would have never happened without the CPGB, even though there's a kind of like long-known thing that the National Party did actually initially try to push activists away from Cable Street, but as the sources show, it rapidly gave that line up after it became clear that any instructions to avoid the Battle of Cable Streets and a confrontation with Mosley, they weren't going to be followed by the local CPGB groups. So the national leadership of the CPGB kind of fell into line because they realised that wasn't a goer. But I always wonder what people who tout this idea that the Battle of Cable Street was a community event, I wonder what they make of pictures of what are obviously communists with clenched fists parading up and down Cable Street. I wonder what they make of the hammers and sickles that you can see chalked and painted on the walls and signs saying "Don't smash workers' shops." I wonder what these people actually think that actually means, and what they get from that, but what Cable Street it was. It's a very unique community event, I would say. As for the slogan of "They shall not pass," in terms of like people from the Labour right using this kind of slogan, well, I generally associate this phrase with members of the Labour Party bureaucracy when they have to deal with left-wing motions at ward meetings. You know, literally, they shall not pass. And if you're lucky enough to get in the meeting these days, that is still, I suppose, at least it's a phrase that will come easily to them. But it would be actually a useful project to trace this change of historical narrative in more detail. And as with the Kinder Scout mass trespass this year, I'm absolutely sure that there'll be an absolute hurricane of nonsense written about Cable Street in 2026, which is when that event has its kind of 90th kind of anniversary. So Cable Street is another example of an event that seems to have been kind of recuperated and taken away from its kind of specific communist identity. But we also have, I also have a more like I also have a more recent kind of like experience of this, really, when we look at the kind of occurrence of the AWL, of all organisations, trying to colonise the history of the CPGB in the cause of the politics of kind of liberal intersectionalism. Now, the AWL is an organisation that has long been traditionally phobic about what it, you know, in fact, it doesn't call it official communism, what I call official communism. Organisations such as the CPGB and organisations that have emanated from that wing of the kind of workers' movement. And generally, in the past, it's kind of had like a, because it can never really, you know, that organisation can never really seriously debate the kind of ins and outs of that, the kind of history of it. So it generally has one tactic in relation to anyone who's in and around these groups, and that emanates from this milieu, and that's usually to squawk tanky or Stalinist as loud as you can, and hey presto, that's the job done, and that's all fixed, and that's all fine and hunky-dory. Operating CPGB figures such as the Communist Labour MP Saklat Vala, they tagged him under the safe and establishment-friendly moniker of Britain's first BAME MP. Saklat Vala was of Indian origin, and they argued that such figures worked on the terrain of kind of intersectionalist identity kind of politics. Now, in that sense, all the AWL is really doing is kind of adapting itself to conventional kind of modern opinion, whereby even figures such as Rajani Palmdutt, who was born to Indian and Swedish parents and long vilified by bourgeois commentators because of his loyalty to the USSR and disloyalty to the British state. Even he's been presented under the moniker on the Open University website as he's under this badge: "Discover how South Asians shaped the nation, 1870 to 1950. Now, even that would probably be a bridge too far for the AWL to kind of recuperate and claim as one of theirs. But the first thing that actually strikes you about the AWL's like generally poorly researched and badly argued kind of effort is the kind of extreme unreality when you look at what figures such as Saklat Vala actually said in the 1920s and 30s. It's crystal clear that Saklat Vala's like main idea was the kind of unity of Indian and British workers. And he expressed this over and over again. And this was just as true of the CPGB itself. When it talked about these types of issues, it always stressed that British workers, what they had in common with Indian workers, rather than what disunited them and what the particular interpolations of identity were. whatever identities people such as Saklat Vala have from their backgrounds were heavily kind of submerged, excuse me, excuse me, were mediated, they were heavily submerged and mediated by the politics of international communism. Their parentage, and even the fact that Saklat Vala attended a Zoroastrian initiation ceremony for his children, whereby the CPGB censored him, and Saklat Vala said he had only done it to retain a trust fund. They don't equate the need for kind of soliloquies on intersectionalism. And one really might imagine the kind of bemusement of people like Saklat Vala and being treated in this way. The 1920s had a much more brutal appreciation of Saklat Vala. They knew he was a communist and they kicked him out, which again gives you a clue as to the fellow's kind of actual identity in the real cut and thrust of politics, rather than this kind of bullshit narrative, that a liberal narrative that the AWL has stuck on these kind of figures subsequently. So we've got there's quite a lot of, that I could find I'm sure I could find other things of the CPGB's history being kind of poached and taken under another badge. But those are the ones that kind of stand out to me and kind of make me think that this is actually, what we're actually seeing is a process of incorporation. We're not seeing something that's kind of fragmentary, just as the CPGB's died, by death from 1,000 opportunist cuts. The kind of history of the organization is also becoming subject to this process of cutting away and chopping up and maiming. Okay. But when we're thinking about how this kind of colonization process, which is what I kind of think of it as, when did it actually begin? Well, it actually began quite late on in the party's history, because during the 20s and 30s, 40s and 50s in particular, latterly when the kind of Cold War was occurring, and then the 20s and 30s and the interwar years, the CPGB, however far its politics kind of drifted to the right under the Popular Front, however soft aspects of its politics kind of became, it was always disreputable, because the British establishment and the establishment of the British Labour movement did not like the CPGB, because they could not rely on its kind of support for the British kind of state and for the ventures of the British state. Now, the CPGB did support ventures of the British state during that kind of those years, and the obvious one being when it supported the Second World War and the imperialist Second World War, which the CPGB unfortunately supported after the Soviet Union had been invaded in 1941. But the CPGB didn't they didn't support that war because they were not at that point particularly keen to support the British establishment. They supported that war because they were loyal to Stalin and the Soviet Union. And even during the Second World War, when the CPGB were involved in that process of when they were involved in that process in the Second World War, the Labour Party never once let up off on its negative propaganda versus the Communist Party, which basically amounted to them saying, you're not going to affiliate to us because you're a secret battalion of communists whose main loyalty is to Moscow. Whereas by that point, the Labour Party was thoroughly immersed in its loyalty to the kind of British state during the Second World War. So this kind of never let up, and the Communist Party never became kind of reputable really during its whole existence, but things did kind of lighten a little bit towards the end. Even when you look at books like Douglas Hyde's I Believed, which is a book written by somebody who left the Communist Party in the immediate post-war era to join the Catholic Church, he wrote an expose of the CPGB. And when you read Douglas Hyde's kind of work, which is very interesting, and I'd encourage anybody to kind of read that, because it's actually quite a brilliant book in places. What Hyde kind of portrays is a party that was the very obverse of kind of like a reputable. The Communist Party knew it wasn't reputable. That's why, when the Daily Worker, and before the Daily Worker was shut down during the Second World War, the party spent, a lot of time setting up, illegal printing presses all over London and other areas to prepare for its illegality. So the CPGB had a pretty shrewd idea of that even though its public front during some of the late 1930s may have been soft, popular front, down with Chamberlain type attitudes, the CPGB wasn't a reputable organisation, and the British establishment treated it like that, and then the Labour Party establishment, the Labour establishment did too. But as I say, it was the CPGB itself that actually opened up the pores of its own history by softening its various kind of political dimensions. And this process originated in its final decades, when the party started to address its history in works by James Klugman, Noreen Branson, and Margot Heinemann. They were all kind of CPG activists and writers of long standing. I'm going to have to oversimplify this a little bit, but the story went something like: the CPGB, formed in 1920, was far too revolutionary for the tastes of the party's right-centrist leadership in the 1960s. The Popular Front of the 1930s, stripped of its practical relationship to Stalin's diplomacy and things like the party of a new type, this was thus projected as the real foundation period of the party. And by the 1970s and 80s, the Euro-communist faction of the party was also venerating the CPGB of the Popular Front era, seeing the 1930s adaptation to bourgeois politics as support for its own inclinations towards adapting to feminism and other social movements, and its kind of aspiration to become the kind of democratic party of all Britons. It's a kind of mini homage to Togliatti's kind of post-1945 Italian Communist Party. Unfortunately, it was largely this perspective of that group of like CPG historians and that era of CPGB history writing that worked its way into the more recent way that academic historians of the party have portrayed the CPGB. Therefore, in Ben Harker's recent cultural history of the party, which is well worth reading, by the way, he draws attention to those moments in the CPGB's history when it seemed the kind of most poorest kind of bourgeois ideas, and that the CPGB sought to adapt itself to British nationalism. So we're talking about the Popular Front of 35 to 39, the late war and post-war so-called Reconstruction period of 1942 to 1947, and the battle of ideas against US imperialism in 1947-1956, where the CPGB again had a very kind of nationalist approach to like British culture. But this kind of softening and blurring of communist politics and identity, and it's kind of an irony of this process of this identity formation, that the one identity that always gets completely snuffed out is the identity of communist. So it's not a very fair, like, identitarian process. So obviously some identities are more, important than others. But this kind of softening of this kind of communist politics and identity meant, of course, that this history was like open up to kind of abuse, because the CPGB sometimes wasn't portrayed as a particularly communist kind of organization. And this process has led to the appropriation of parts of like our party's history by anti-communists, which is a kind of sure sign that that this history writing and these processes have failed on even the most basic levels of kind of historical empathy. and our side, really, if you like, the Leninist side, which is broadly defined, is largely missing from the historical narrative, even though the kind of opposition that groups like the Leninists came out of, and its various forms, it would have touched like hundreds of CPGB activists in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. We're talking about Maoist opposition, the oppositions around straight left, and the oppositions later around the Morning Star. These would have touched hundreds, if not thousands, of CPG activists, and most of them had like a version of the fact that to one degree or another linked to pro-Soviet politics, that the party had gone soft and reformist. That wasn't like an idea that you wouldn't hear if you mixed with communists in those eras. I'm sure other comrades would tell you better than me, but you would have kind of heard that, and you can see that like occurring in various kind of tranches of opposition to such as the debate they had over the British Road to Socialism in 1977. This was like a widespread kind of opposition, but those voices never ever appear, or they only appear with under the tutelage of kind of simple abuse in the kind of histories that are written. Whereas if you're Beatrix Campbell or Martin Jakes, you're obviously going to get a much more kind of sympathetic kind of reception. So these reactions of the old CPGB from the 1960s to its history, they kind of set the terrain, really. They kind of set out the terrain for what's happened subsequently. You'll be glad to know I'm coming to the end soon, and I think my voice sounds like it's going to pack up anyway. So how do we go about defeating this, and has there been any kind of reaction to this? Well, I think we have to give some credit to the latter-day Communist Party of Britain and Morning Star's Communist Party of Britain and its own kind of version of the YCL, because they've clearly identified this problem that the party's kind of been appropriated by kind of by kind of alien forces, and they've tried to address it with some kind of mixed results, which I don't have time to go into the detail of all of those. They produce some books that CPB writers have produced have been very good. Some have been plain terrible. In my opinion, like most of this kind of writing, it kind of suffers from an empiricist method whereby it just largely recounts things or activists associated with the old CPGB, and very little critique, very little analysis of its kind of politics, very little balance sheet, very little what's right and what's wrong. You just get these kind of like narratives of what happened, or what somebody thinks has happened, or what a source tells you happened. But ultimately, this can coexist quite nicely, really, with the histories produced by like Euro-communist influence historians, as it poses very little existential threat to it, because it doesn't have a counter kind of narrative to it. It just tells you that the CPGB did this and that, for the most part. Also, I've seen more recent examples of the YCL, the Young Communist League, that's the YCL of our time, talking about the old YCL that was run by the official CPGB, and trying to kind of reappropriate even kind of more controversial aspects of the old YCL from the 1960s. There was a thing in 1967, around 1967, called the Trend Campaign, which crudely put and very simply put represents an attempt by the old YCL leadership of the 1960s to adapt itself to the youth culture of that time, as against the kind of more politicized culture of the YCL left, which at that point was also being infected and influenced by Maoism. It wasn't that trendy because apparently drawing competitions were at the cutting edge of for youth in 1967. So even though you might have had a chance to see the Kinks, or I think the Who played at some kind of YCL events in the 1960s, you also had this kind of paternalistic, kind of patronizing attitude to kind of youth, which was the very kind of obverse of Trend. So it was a very but it was kind of strange that the kind of modern YCL wants to kind of present that as something kind of worthwhile, given the amount of annoyance it caused to the left at the time. But this exemplifies the problem of the modern day YCL. Basically, it sees itself as a pure kind of continuation of the old Young Communist League, and therefore it appears to think it has to absorb all of the old CPGB's history and all of the old YCL's history, like revisionist kind of warts and all. That leads it straight back to the politics of the modern day softening and appropriation of the CP's history by alien kind of class forces, because you know that some of the events and some of the activities that they're using as examples were precisely infected in the sort of kind of revisionism that kind of led into this kind of thing where the CPGB's history can be, you know, appropriated by the likes of Caroline Lucas or Roy Hattersley or whoever it is. The modern day YCL has attempted to celebrate the militant aspects of the Kinderscouts trespass, and I believe that they had an event where they all climbed to the summit, you know, with red flags and trying to you know, recapture the spirit of the original event. And I think, I'm not sectarian, I think that that's a good thing that they're trying to do that. But you can't be doing that. You can't be marching up to the top of Kinderscout waving red flags and then start talking up some of the kind of like soft left politics that the YCL had by the 60s, 70s and 80s, which led to its complete dissolution a few years before the CPGB itself. So that's one kind of way of kind of appropriating, and I think that that's a false route which will lead the comrades into trouble. That all sounds very pessimistic, and I'm just going to finally finish up. So more optimistically, though, however, we've recently seen how a kind of relatively small group of historians, relatively small group, although, you know, there's quite a few of them, but a relatively small group of historians, so they've begun to change the historical narrative of the Second International. You know, and that's, you know, that's the product of quite small amounts of people, although it's involved quite a lot of disciplined historical work. And while the rebuilding of class parties as a close to micro sects is a kind of tremendous task, small groups of historians dedicated to a more critical account of the CPGB and work in a disciplined manner could change the way and could have an impact on the way we view its history and stop the kind of historical vandalism inherent in watching anti-communists appropriating our history for their own kind of nefarious ends. So if anyone's listening to this and fancies getting stuck into this task, I can assure them that there's plenty to get stuck into. But I think these kind of tasks, these kind of ideological tasks, they are more achievable by small kind of groups of people. So the current kind of vandalism that's going on of our history and of our kind of past, it is something that could be like countered, and it is something that can be defeated. I can't see it being completely overthrown, but and ultimately it does rely on the workers' movement, instead of accepting the establishment events where you go and listen to some, Bill and Mary reformist, talking about, talking about the kind of romance of the Kinderscouts mass trespass. It does rely on our movement organising our own separate events to counter that narrative. And these are the type of events that, if our movement was like anything at all, these type of establishment events would be the type of thing we'll be picketing and disrupting, really, because they're nothing but vandalism. And just to finish, the contemporary celebration of the Kinderscouts massacre has got absolutely like nothing to do with the circumstances of 1932 and everything to do with like selling reformism, with a more romantic kind of face. I'll leave that there. Cheers, Tom.